Hello, so this is part two of my past paper walkthrough for civil rights in the USA, 1850 to 2009. And in this video, I'm going to be talking through section B of the exam. Obviously, in the exam, as you can see here, you need to just do one of these questions. So you just pick one. But I'm going to do plan both of them here. So let's get going with the plan for these questions. So the first thing we will do is highlight the key terms. So the first question is: the exclusion of Black Americans from the vote was the most damaging setback to their fight for civil rights in the years 1883 to circa 1900. So the factor we've got here that we've been given is the exclusion of Black Americans from the vote. So this is a kind of obstacles question because we're talking about the most damaging setback to their fight for civil rights. Okay, so most damaging setback to their fight for civil rights, and it's covering the whole period of topic 2, 1883 to 1900. So let's have a think about this. So we need to define what we mean by their fight for civil rights. What do we mean by civil rights? And I would always go for social, political, and economic equality. So that's what we are going for. So the exclusion of Black Americans from the vote, was it the most significant kind of obstacle to the advancement of social, political, and economic equality for Black Americans? Right, so paragraph 1 is always the factor in the question. So the exclusion from the vote. And if you think about, so how were Black Americans excluded from the vote? Well, really, we're talking about loopholes in the 15th Amendment. Okay, and the kind of things we're thinking about are the introduction of grandfather clauses, poll tax, literacy tests, those kind of things. We could also mention here the 1898 Mississippi versus Williams case in the Supreme Court, which upheld voting qualifications. So that's the kind of things we talk about in that paragraph. Now, in terms of an argument here, and I've kind of jumped ahead and done that first paragraph, but planning it, you'd probably think, well, what's my argument going to be before I get going? So I would argue, I think, for this one, that it was actually Supreme Court decisions were the most damaging setback to the fight for civil rights for Black Americans. The exclusion from voting was obviously hugely significant, but it mainly affected political rights. You could argue it affected other rights too, absolutely, but just for the sake of argument, I would say it's Supreme Court decisions because they affected all types of rights, as we will see in just a second when I talk about that paragraph. So let's, go with that as an argument. So paragraph 2, I would talk about Supreme Court decisions, okay? And specifically, we're thinking about the 1883 civil rights cases, which the most significant one there is that overturns the 1875 Civil Rights Act, which was against discrimination in public places. So that was hugely damaging to Black American civil rights, to social rights. Specifically, so that could be a good way to kind of counter that to the one in the question. You could also here obviously talk about the 1896 Plessy decision, and that upholds Jim Crow, basically separate but equal, so segregation. And you'd say that arguably, you could say that is the most damaging decision of all here. And then finally, if you wanted a third piece of evidence, you could talk about Cumming versus Board of Education, which upholds segregated education. And so you could see there that we're talking about things that affect social rights, also economic rights, if you think about education potentially. Also, if you go back to paragraph 1, Mississippi versus Williams, that's a Supreme Court decision. So the Supreme Court actually were part of the exclusion of Black Americans from the vote. So that's why I think I would argue this is the most significant setback. Okay, and then for a third paragraph, I think I would go for kind of like general kind of like white attitudes and you could talk about things like lynching here, the use of lynching and violence. And, you know, if you think about precise piece of evidence, you can maybe talk about Ida B. Wells and the fact that she actually had to leave the South because of that lynching and violence that she campaigned against. You could also talk about the introduction of Jim Crow and segregation, and the Florida Railroad as the first example of that. So that's how I would go about answering that question 3. So as I said, I'd argue Supreme Court most significant Supreme Court decisions were the most damaging setback, rather than the exclusion of Black Americans from the vote, because they affected all aspects of civil rights, and actually they did play a hand in the exclusion of Black Americans from the vote. The Supreme Court also gave the green light to Jim Crow, and actually you could argue kind of, you know, didn't stand in the way of those attitudes which are holding Black Americans back from having equality. And Supreme Court also, gave the go-ahead to the exclusion of Black Americans from the vote. So that's how I would go about that one. Okay, let's go for question 4 then. So the question here is, how far was the influence of Southern whites in the Democrat Party the chief cause of the failure to address the grievances of Black Americans during the New Deal years? So for this one, if we just go to the highlighter again, and let's have a look here. So the influence of Southern whites in the Democrat Party, the chief cause of the failure to address the grievances of Black Americans. So again, it's a obstacles question, and this one is the influence of Southern whites in the Democrat Party. That's the factor that we've been given. And we're talking about the failure to address grievances of Black Americans. So again, the definition, what are the grievances? Well, I think it would be the most straightforward way would be to think about social, political, and economic issues, discrimination, you know, that Black Americans faced in the New Deal years. And again, this covers the whole topic of the whole period of topic 3, 1933 to 1941. And for this one, if I start with my argument this time, as I should have done for the last question, I would actually argue that yes, it was the influence of Southern whites in the Democrat Party which were the chief cause of the failure to address grievances of Black Americans. And the reason for that is, I would say that FDR was unable to address grievances of Black Americans because he relied on Southern Democrats. And that meant that any attempt to promote equality in any way was hindered by the influence of Southern Democrats. Okay, and we'll get into this. We'll get into this in when we plan. So if we think about Southern Democrats as obviously as paragraph 1, okay, and the key thing here, I think, the key piece of evidence is the failure to address lynching and the use of the filibuster to block this anti-lynching legislation. Okay, and specifically we're talking about 1934, the Costigan-Wagner bill, which was blocked by Southern Democrats, and another attempt in 1937. So both times there's an attempt to pass anti-lynching legislation which is blocked by Southern Democrats. Okay, another thing you could talk about is exploiting loopholes or ensuring there are loopholes in laws in New Deal laws. So for example, Social Security. Okay. Okay. So then paragraph. So I would argue that that's the most significant factor. And my second paragraph would be on FDR. Failure to address Black American grievances. That it was actually FDR was a factor as well. But my argument here would be that FDR's main focus was on the economy, okay? And the New Deal was mainly focused on the economy and economic issues, providing work. And an example of that is like discrimination on a local level So the way that the New Deal worked was that it would be issued out, and then on it, the welfare would be issued out, and then on a local level it would be distributed. And this meant that on a local level there was discrimination towards Black Americans. For example, significantly in the TVA. I would also say that because of the Southern Democrats, Roosevelt had to use executive orders so it's almost like a counterpoint to the argument of the paragraph, that he had to use executive orders, to address grievances. Most significantly, Executive Order AA02, which led to the FEPC in 1941. Okay, I have done a video on the content for this topic and all the topics that you can look at, and I'll put this in the description. Also on how to write essays in full, because I'm not talking about kind of context, definition, argument. I'm not going into like the structure of paragraphs. So obviously I would do all of that. I'm just talking about the plan here. Okay, but I would ultimately say that FDR, because he was reliant on Southern Democrats, that was the main issue that was holding FDR back, and his focus on the economy, rather than him being against civil rights per se. The last one, and I think this is something that in the content of this topic, there's not a huge amount in kind of textbooks, but I would say kind of lack of help from the Supreme Court here. And there's a few decisions here that I'm just gonna write down, and then I'll talk through them all together. So the first one is Trudeau versus Barnes. The second one is Breedlove versus Suttles, which is 1937. And the final one is Gaines v. Canada, which is 1938. Okay, so I'm not going to write all the details here. I'm just going to talk through these. So Trudeau versus Barnes. What that decision stated was that any civil rights cases, any appeals, had to be exhausted on a state level before they went to the Supreme Court, Trudeau versus Barnes. And what that meant was that it really slowed down the work of the NAACP. So then I would say that the Supreme Court, therefore, is a cause of the failure to address grievances of Black Americans, right? Because it's slowing down the work of the NAACP. Breedlove versus Suttles upheld poll tax. So again, that's if we're talking about grievances of Black Americans, political rights, poll tax meant that, and economic rights, but poll tax meant that Black Americans couldn't often vote. It was a kind of way of stopping Black Americans from voting. And then the third Supreme Court decision, Gaines versus Canada, said that, so on one hand, it looks fairly positive, but it's not. When you get into it, it's not. It said that separate but equal must be equal. So it looks like something of a success, but it upholds the Plessy decision. It doesn't say segregation is unconstitutional, so it kind of upholds that. So I would say that, these decisions by the Supreme Court really just maintain the status quo. So in terms of the failure to address grievances, they're not promoting, other than Gaines versus Canada, which is kind of, it's kind of, what is it, kind of like de jure, kind of, it's not really changing things, but it is saying, it must be equal. They're really not promoting civil rights or advancing civil rights in any way. Therefore, I would say that Southern Democrats were the most significant obstacle here to the advancement of Black American civil rights. Okay, I hope that was useful. Please leave any comments or questions below, and I'll do my best to answer them. I'll put links to my other videos, my other relevant videos, in the description. Thank you for listening.